Peaceful, quiet mind starts as a practice, then a habit, and finally a beautiful new way of life. So, how do we train for a peaceful, quiet mind? First, let's understand why the mind is agitated and active. There are several factors that often feed each other in kind of a loop. First, there can be a sensation in the body or an emotion that you habitually, usually unconsciously avoid. We avoid the bodily sense by going into the head and feeding a narrative about the situation. Number two is really a big one, arguing with reality. This could be so many different things, but trying to change another person or the past or some circumstance in your life that you do not have control over, or wishing that that circumstance is different, that is a recipe for suffering. And number three is buying into a narrative or story in thought. When we place attention on thought, it grows and solidifies. But when we let a thought arise and then leave on its own without feeding it with our attention, then it just comes and goes, and it's very ethereal, not solid. And number four, judgment and resistance. So as these narratives and emotions intensify, an additional layer forms. We think something like, this is bad, I hate this. And then the old adage, whatever you resist persists, plays out. So, as I said, these reinforce and cycle through each other. A trigger and a noisy mind can start with a thought or with an emotion or a bodily sensation. This can be in response to an outside event, or it could just spontaneously arise. So, for example, there could suddenly just be a feeling of sadness appearing, or I'd say a sensation and emotion that we're labeling as sadness. And then a story that vibrationally matches that emotion can show up. I feel sad because fill in the blank. Emotions are usually very short lived unless they are fed. And as I previously mentioned, thoughts are really the same way. Thoughts and emotions just come and go unless we feed them with our attention. So we can see that the narrative feeds and intensifies the emotion, and they just loop over each other back and forth, feeding each other, intensifying. Stream of thoughts, the layer of judgment and resistance then kicks in and solidifies it even more. This is what happens when we get triggered or when our mind is just simply active and we are feeling mentally unwell. So, how do we break this cycle? Well, now that you're aware of how this plays out, you can observe it as it happens in real time. Try to approach it with curiosity instead of judgment. Have this perspective of, isn't it interesting how this plays out? See if you can get a little space from it, what I would call witness consciousness, where you're able to just kind of back up from it and get some space. And the way we do this is by focusing on small things in everyday life. If we try to start with your most intense, lifelong trigger and trauma, the likelihood of you being able to get space from that and work on it is pretty slim if you're picking that as your first thing to work on. So, this can really be a daily and an ongoing moment by moment practice once you start to just get the hang of it. And I want to give you a common one in the Washington, D.C. area where I live. I noticed that I was frequently agitated and in a hurry when I was driving, even when I was not actually late or under any type of external time pressure. And so the first thing I did was notice the sensation in the body, a certain nervous, anxious energy stirring in the chest. And I allowed it. And I just let it move through without resistance. I noticed how that anxious energy showed up in thought. Why is that person driving so slow? Get out of the way. Now, see that this doesn't need to be judged. It's just an unconscious habit. By getting some space, the absurdity of it's seen. Laughter and levity are really great here. Laugh at the absurdity of it. Laugh at yourself. Laugh at your inner world. Maybe take a deep breath. Be present. Get over into a slower lane. Stop feeding it and watch it calm down. Another small example. I noticed I was really agitated going to the grocery store. That same irritated, anxious energy in the chest. Again, I let it be there without labeling it a problem. And I noticed the thought, I hate going to the grocery store. And then I laughed at the silliness of it. Here I was creating this false identity as the one who hates going to the grocery store. I was literally creating this made up character in my head as the one who hates going to the grocery store. And then I was identifying as that character. So, through this observation and presence, I made going to the grocery store a peaceful, meditative experience. And then this really carries over into every area of life. Once you start making a habit, it starts snowballing. Once you first have to push the snowball up the hill, so to speak. But at a certain point, you get to the top of the hill and then it starts rolling down, having a momentum of its own. So if you make this your habit, your meditation, to notice what's going on inside of you, be curious, deconstruct the patterns. It'll start happening automatically. The mind becomes quiet because you are accepting reality and not buying into its thoughts. That's the only reason it's spinning up and going crazy is because you're having a problem with whatever is going on, either within you or in the external circumstances. So if your attention is not turned to thought and feeding it, it just fizzled out on its own. And if you don't resist the emotion, you allow yourself to feel it fully, let it come and go in its own timing. It loses its momentum and power and eventually stops arising altogether. The thing I noticed with my emotional patterns is that now that I don't fight them, they come and go very quickly. Sometimes they come up as slightly more intense, but for a much shorter duration. And I don't view them as a problem. It's not suffering anymore. So the fun part after you do this for a while is when you notice their pattern is trying to spin up and it just gets noticed right away because the mind has been trained and it's such a habit, just gets noticed and cut off before it can even fully form into a thought or an emotion. And that is an amazing feeling. Eventually, this peace spreads to all areas of life, even the big things that would have stopped you in your tracks before. Life itself becomes wrapped in a layer of peace and serenity. Then, the more quiet and peaceful the mind becomes, the easier it is to gain spiritual wisdom and insight. And the more the answers like, who am I, start to reveal themselves. Who am I? Who am I beyond thought, beyond concept? Who am I when the mind is quiet? Who am I beyond language? These are deep questions that cannot be answered with words. They must be directly experienced. But once you do experience that natural state, what the Indian philosophy would call Satchitananda, which means eternal conscious bliss. Once you experience that which is the natural state, you will find all of this effort has been worth it. Thank you so much for listening.